In order to use a cost-effective hydraulic brake steel, Pakistan used scrap iron to melt and glue. After simple processing on their lathe, they could produce strong and durable brake steel. The scrapped truck parts in front of them are the main materials for their small workshop. In order to facilitate the melting of scrap iron, who first had to knock the scrap parts into pieces, which could only speed up the melting of scrap iron. The small volume can also be better heated in the furnace. In the process of melting scrap iron into molten iron, Fu first had to inject and rub the brake steel. When the finished mold is positioned inside, Fu had to fill the sandbox with mixed sand. In order to prevent the internal hollow bones from cracking, the filled sand had to be compacted to ensure that the internal sand was more compact, because the mold is generally divided into upper and lower layers. The second layer of sandbox needs to be fixed after turning over. In this way, the base of the mold can be made with sand. After practicing and filling quickly, the finished mold standing inside needs to be taken out. When the gap between the upper and lower molds is, it is the space that needs to be filled with molten iron. Then it is baked and heated inside the high-temperature slurry. The soft sand will crack and collapse. The inside of the brake cylinder is hollow. As for the inside, a sand core is needed to prevent the finished product from being poured into a stone core. After the masters have made a batch of molds, the scrap iron inside has also turned into molten iron. In order to make the poured molten iron purer, the impurities floating on the surface need to be bitten out by the master. Part of the impurities will affect the quality of the finished product. After the master divides the molten iron through the plastic bag, it needs to be poured into the mold while it is hot. Although one mold can produce two brake cylinders at the same time, the amount of molten iron required is not much. After the glue is completed, it is necessary to wait for 30 seconds of molding. It can be directly separated from the sandbox. After the masters demold all the molds, the temperature of the brake cylinder is very high at this time. Some blanks need to wait for 24 hours of cooling. The first step is to use a lathe to remove the side hair characters to ensure that the edge of the side is flush, which also has high requirements for the inner wall of the brake steel. In order not to affect the normal driving of the piston, the part needs to be cut. Under the very fast operation of the master, the inner diameter after processing needs to be compared to avoid over-processing. When there is no sand hole on the inner wall, dust covers need to be installed on both sides of the brake steel. In order to firmly fix it on the outer ring, the master needs to cut a fixed groove with a slot cutter to achieve the purpose of clamping and fixing the dust cover, because the fixed contact surface must be flat and smooth. Our small workshop does not have a professional lathe, so we can only use our homemade bracket to fix it on the lathe claw. The master controls the movement of the tool holder to make the sides smooth and flat. Although their conditions are simple and the equipment is ordinary, the master's mind is very extraordinary. In order to make the inner arm reach the level of the engine steel set, the master also needs to make a simple aircraft model of the brake steel. Although their equipment is semi-automatic, the master's hand speed is not slow. It took 1 minute to complete the inner arm for the aircraft model. The processing has been completed in order to prevent some defective products. The first appearance cutting is done manually. The entire surface may rust to make the brake steel more beautiful and upscale. The qualified product will be sprayed with rust-proof machine. When the two sides are sealed with rubber sleeves, the surface will not affect the subsequent installation. After the paint on the surface of the brake steel is dry, in order to check whether the brake steel can be used normally, the master needs to install the necessary piston inside and then install the aftertaste spring. Simple test. Although they do not have airtightness testing equipment, sometimes just a simple blow can detect whether the brake steel has air leakage. The hydraulic brake steel made of scrap iron has been produced. What do you think of the skills of the Pakistani masters?